May God bless your time with all goodness and affection. Welcome to the Market of Tales and Stories channel. Today's story is titled The Forest Girl, one of our exciting tales. I hope you enjoy it. Put on your headphones, close your eyes, and listen. Music. Once upon a time, in ancient days, in times long past, and no speech is pleasant except with the mention of the most merciful, and prayers and peace be upon our Master Muhammad, the best of creation. The story Prince Jawed was a handsome young man, dignified in temperament, broad in culture, pure in reputation. A bright future awaited him as the coming king of the land. No one in the entire royal family challenged his right to the throne, for he was his parents' only son, and the only male in the ruling generation. Therefore Jawed was a dream that haunted palace princesses, daughters of nobles and the wealthy, and even the most wretched girls in the remote corners of the kingdom. However, this story, which almost resembled legends, had one flaw that could not be ignored. The prince had absolutely no desire to marry. Since he turned 18, his mother had been presenting him with a new girl every day, accompanied by processions of gold, perfumes, and jewels, with the courtiers singing her praises. His father sent messengers and aides throughout the kingdom, and even beyond, searching for a princess or wealthy woman befitting his status. Yet despite all this, Jawed rejected every girl presented to him. Indeed, he often rejected her before even seeing her, hearing her name, or learning her qualities. This habit became a perplexing mystery to the royal family. One night, the king, queen, and vizier gathered, exchanging bewilderment and concern, trying to understand the secret of this strange aversion. The queen said, worry clearly evident in her tone, "He must be taken to a doctor. I feel our son suffers from a hidden and dangerous illness." The king answered, waving his hand angrily in the air, "No, rather he is bewitched. There's no other explanation. We'll bring someone to break the spell and nullify the schemes of the envious and corrupt." But the vizier said in a low voice, trying not to anger anyone, "My lord and my lady, with all humility, I believe the prince has simply not yet found that girl who touches his heart and resembles his soul." The king shouted, his chest tightening with impatience. "We've presented him with dozens of princesses and hundreds of noble women of every shape and color. We sent to snow mountains, palm plains, and coral islands, and gathered for him the most beautiful of the beautiful. And you say he hasn't found someone suitable for him? Should we bring her down from the sky or pull out a sea bride from the ocean depths?" The king was, of course, being sarcastic, trying to release some of his anger, as the matter had become unbearable. His only son, heir to the throne, refused marriage, and this meant the royal family's lineage was threatened with extinction, and the ruling dynasty would vanish if the prince didn't produce an heir. But the prince was stubborn, firm in his position, unmoved by a mother's tears, a father's shouts, or princess's smiles. What was to be done? How could the doors of his heart be opened? One clear morning, while the palace corridors buzzed with maids' whispers about a new bride coming from the kingdom of flowers, Jawed was silently packing his belongings. He decided to escape from all this noise, from the pursuit of brides, and from his parents' unending pressures. He intended to embark on a long hunting trip, a journey without a fixed destination, where he would commune with the desert and the days, perhaps finding something to heal his soul from hidden distress. He was accustomed to hunting trips, but they never exceeded a week or two. This time, however, the king was shocked when he asked, "How long will you be gone this time, my son?" The prince answered with the strange simplicity, 2 months, perhaps 3, father." The king's mouth opened in amazement, and he exclaimed, Months? Why all this absence? The prince smiled a faint smile, as if hiding something, then said, I'll go to the great desert and perhaps visit the redheads' tribe beyond it. The king shook his head and looked at his wife with concern, feeling his son was fleeing from something or seeking something known only to him. He tried hard to dissuade the prince from his resolve, reminding him that he was needed in the capital for governance matters and state councils. But Jawed, as usual, was firm in his opinion, unmoved by pleas, unswayed by advice, mother's entreaties, or father's anger. As soon as he left the palace gate, he headed directly toward a small hunting cabin he owned in the forest depths. There he decided to spend 2 or 3 days away from the palace noise, contemplating his future and his life, which he felt didn't suit him, as if it had been written for him with someone else's pen. As for that alleged hunting trip, it was nothing more than a ruse he wanted to use to hide his true desire, to escape pressures, break free from the chains of courtesies and the brides besieging him daily, and find peace with himself for a while. The prince spent his first night in the cabin, in silence, with stars dancing above the forest canopy, their light sneaking through the tall tree leaves. With the first threads of dawn, he rose early, wore simple hunting clothes, and began touring the forest, accompanied by his 3 companions. The forest had changed greatly from what he knew. Spring this year came differently, overflowing with life. The earth flourished with herbs and colorful plants, and new trees grew in places where they hadn't been before, covering old paths and blocking the trails the prince knew. The prince and his companions had to change their route repeatedly, detouring through alternative side roads. But little by little, they found themselves taking a strange path they'd never seen before. Lumberjack's hands had removed vast areas of the forest in previous years, but new trees grew quickly and formed mysterious labyrinths amid the tangled greenery. Old passages became lost, and new mixed with old. The 3 companions, men expert in the forest, tried to recognize the location, but they all seemed lost. The small expedition kept going in circles, worry seeping into their hearts. Before noon, Jawed wiped his brow impatiently, sighed with frustration, and said, By God, it's as if I'm seeing it for the first time. It's our forest. How will we return to the cabin? Everyone stopped, thinking and looking left and right. They reviewed the marks on the trees, then decided to press forward and take a chance. Perhaps luck would help them. They circled and circled, branching right and left, seeing neither their old path nor any trace of the cabin. When the sun began tilting toward sunset and shadow overtook the forest, suddenly the cabin appeared before them, as if emerging from nowhere. The 4 exchanged astonished looks, and the prince breathed in relief, then said while wiping sweat from his face, By God, this is one of the strangest adventures I've experienced in my life. But wait, friends. He suddenly stopped 2 steps from the cabin door, stared at it long, and said puzzled to his companions, Is this really our cabin? Something doesn't seem familiar. Before anyone could answer, a calm, sarcastic voice came with steady tone. Of course not, because this is my cabin. The 4 turned at once toward the voice's source, and before them stood a young woman with confidence and steadiness. Her hair was astonishingly long, its locks falling until their ends touched the ground. Her face was intensely beautiful, her features a mix of innocence and sharpness. The woman stood before them without hesitation or fear, looking at them as if accustomed to meeting strangers. The men exchanged cautious glances while Jawed swallowed his saliva, then said, Excuse me, young lady, aren't you mistaken? Isn't this cabin ours? The woman stepped forward, carrying a clay jug in her arms, placed it on the ground, turned toward him and said, "First, my name is Naja, not young lady, as you so graciously call me. And second, this is my cabin, and I'm not lost, as you think, little boy." She said it with firm sarcasm, standing before them as if facing 4 children who'd lost their toys, not 4 grown men lost in the forest. The prince's companions were struck with astonishment, and one of them nearly exploded with rage and was about to shout in the woman's face at her rudeness. But Jawed preceded him with a sharp look that silenced his tongue and commanded silence without words. Then the prince stepped toward her and said, "Listen, Naja, the paths confused us in the forest, and we couldn't return to our hunting cabin. If you guide us to the road, I'll reward you generously and give you some money." She didn't answer directly, but picked up the clay jug she'd been carrying, headed toward the cabin, opened it calmly, put what she had inside, then returned to him with confident steps and eyes that feared no one. She said, without yielding her sharpness, "Fine, I'll lead you to your miserable cabin, not out of greed for your money, but because I can't stand your presence around me for another moment. Spare me your evil and be gone from my sight." Her words were like a whip, her tone respecting neither rank nor appearance. The prince's companions were bothered by her manner of speech, and one of them was about to respond, but a look from Jawed stopped them. He himself was annoyed, even angry at her audacity, but he saw wisdom in tolerating her. She was the only thread that might return them to their path. He said to himself, "When we return to the cabin, I'll surprise her with my identity and make her regret every rude word she uttered. My punishment for her will be an unforgettable lesson." As for the woman, she led them without looking back, pointed her arm toward one of the paths, and said mockingly, this way, boys." Jawed ground his teeth in anger but held his silence and nudged his horse to follow her. When her voice came again, slowly, "There's no room for horses among these thick trees. Either walk on your feet or ride goats' backs if you find any." She looked at them with a blatant, sarcastic gaze as if enjoying humiliating them. They felt insulted, but it was an insult they couldn't respond to because they needed her. So they dismounted their horses and began pulling their reins behind them, following the woman's steps as she cut a path for them between tree trunks and tangled branch circles. The paths were narrow, obstructing the horses and slowing their steps, making the journey exhausting and difficult. Branching roads and tangled circles followed one another, and they didn't know if she was really leading them to an exit or turning them in an endless maze. Fatigue appeared on their faces, their feet grew heavy, and their features sagged until they thought they were in an endless green nightmare. Suddenly, from behind a curtain of tall trees, their cabin appeared. "Praise God!" one of them shouted, and they all rushed toward the cabin, running with whatever energy remained. Their mouths were dry, their backs dripping sweat, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion having taken their toll. Without thinking, they stormed the cabin, drank from the water skins until satisfied, then collapsed on the ground. Minutes passed before Jawed remembered something important. The girl. He remembered how she'd guided them despite all her mockery, how she alone had saved them from being lost in this vast forest. Despite the roughness in her speech, he felt mild embarrassment and said to himself, "Even rudeness, if you're granted a favor, don't meet it with ingratitude." He rose quietly and headed to a small box where he kept gold coins. He took some and left the cabin to give them to the woman. But she wasn't there, no trace of her, no shadow, not even footprints on the ground. Naja had disappeared as suddenly as she'd appeared. Jawed stood at the cabin threshold staring at the silent forest, feeling this woman wasn't like others, and that their meeting might be the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Prince Jawed looked around in every direction with worried eyes, searching left and right, moving with tense steps to the cabin edges, then returning to stare at tree trunks and the damp earth, searching for any trace indicating the woman. But there was nothing, as if she'd never been there at all. He stood confused and bewildered, trying to comprehend what had happened. When his closest aide approached him, he said, "Excuse me, my lord. It's clear she left before we noticed." Jawed nodded his head, then said, "Truly this is a great fault. We should have at least thanked her before she left. She saved me, the crown prince, from being lost." "I didn't even say thank you," the aide answered, trying to lighten the situation. "No matter, my lord. We can send scouts tomorrow to the forest, and we'll find her, God willing. Then your highness can give her the reward befitting her deed." Jawed's heart clung to that hope. Yes, they would find her and return the favor as proper and show her he wasn't one of those who forget kindness. When dawn broke the next day, the prince summoned 6 of the most skilled and experienced forest scouts and immediately asked them, "Do you know of a cabin inhabited by a young woman with long hair whose ends touched the ground?" The men looked at each other. Then one answered, "My lord, there are no inhabited cabins in the deep thickets. All have been abandoned for many years. Some have collapsed, and some are inhabited by wild beasts who've made them their dens." But Jawed bristled and said, "No, I saw her, a young woman with astonishingly long hair, living in a cabin in the middle of the forest. She's the one who guided us back yesterday. You must find the cabin and bring her here by any means." The men obeyed his order without discussion and set out on their mission, searching the forest inch by inch, investigating paths and storming hidden passages. But they found nothing except old abandoned cabins, broken and dilapidated. They returned after many hours, reporting their disappointment to the prince. But the prince wasn't convinced. He rejected their report and decided to lead the search himself. Day after day he went out with them, leading them with his own eyes, not their maps, moving from corner to corner, searching the forest corner by corner until he knew it by heart. But he found nothing. No cabin, no woman, not even a footprint or mark in the mud indicating her presence. The matter began to worry him more than he'd thought. Her image began haunting him in his waking hours, her features appearing to him in the heart of the night. She wasn't just a girl he'd met by chance. There was something unforgettable in her eyes. When he found no trace of her and couldn't continue his life drowning in this mystery, he finally decided to return to the palace. He gathered his companions, arranged his belongings, and set off returning, contrary to his previous plan. He'd told his parents he'd be gone 2 months or more, and here he was returning after just a few days. When he reached the palace gates, everyone was amazed at his sudden return. Servants rushed to transport his things while he headed toward the palace hall, hiding in his eyes a tension no one had seen in him before. As for the king and queen, they showed no surprise at his return, but were delighted, for they'd been preparing a great surprise for him. A new bride. After months of exhausting search and investigation, after trying dozens of princesses and noble women, the king and queen thought they'd finally found the ideal bride, one in whom their only son, Prince Jawed, could find no fault or refuse to marry. She was a girl of complete specifications, as the queen had wished, cultured, beautiful, dignified, wealthy, and of noble lineage. She belonged to a noble house with deep historical roots, going back to a family that had ruled these lands decades ago. Her grandfather had once voluntarily abdicated the throne to the current king's grandfather, then left to roam God's lands as a merchant and seeker, a lover of knowledge and travel. He left behind accumulated wealth, a respected title, and children who inherited this strange love of learning and contemplation. As for the girl herself, she was a unique fabric of beauty and awareness. Thick black hair, steady eyes, fluent in several languages, loving the study of philosophy and history, possessing an extensive library containing rare manuscripts she'd collected herself from throughout the kingdom. When the king's envoy first saw her, they were stunned. Majestic beauty, rare intellect, and captivating personality. They went directly to her uncle, her guardian after her father's death, and proposed on behalf of the crown prince. The uncle nearly fainted from joy and considered it an unparalleled honor. But in his enthusiasm, he rushed to his brother's daughter to tell her the good news, expecting a grateful look or a tear of joy. But her response came like a slap. "I don't want to marry, uncle. Not now and not ever." He stared at her in amazement and said, "But he's the prince of the land, the crown prince," she said with even greater firmness. "Even if he were king of the world, I won't marry him." The uncle became confused and felt bewildered. If he pressured her, she might force herself into marriage and become miserable. If he refused, the king might become angry and bring down upon him and his brother's daughter an unbearable punishment. But the girl, as if sensing what was in his heart, spared him all those anxieties and did what no one expected. She left the city altogether, departing secretly at night, without trace, news, or even a message. The uncle fell into great confusion. Distress descended upon him like a storm. He spent days tasting no food, enjoying no sleep, thinking how to escape this predicament that might threaten him and anger the Sultan. Then his wife intervened with a brilliant plan. On the day the king's envoys returned to ask for the girl's answer, the uncle received them with a sad face, head bowed, and said, "My brother's daughter has died." The envoys were shocked, and one said, "Died? How? Wasn't she well?" The uncle replied, "The plague struck her suddenly. Not even one night passed before she died." The envoys returned to the king and queen with the shocking news. The king's face changed, and he said, with despair and displeasure, "He's an unlucky young man. Even when we find him a girl of complete qualities, she dies suddenly." The uncle breathed, having escaped a crisis he'd feared would anger the king. But the more difficult predicament remained. Where had the girl gone? He sent his men and acquaintances to every corner, searching in old palace ruins, remote mountains, and abandoned gardens, but without trace. Finally, the uncle gave up and sat in his house, sadly, remembering what his brother's daughter always told him. "I'll travel to distant lands and spend my life studying medicine and sciences, far from any marriage and any throne." He smiled sadly and said to himself, Perhaps she really did it." On the same day the news of the noblewoman's death was announced. The prince returned to the palace, obeying his parents' order after his long absence. He didn't know that news awaiting him would please him more than he expected. His mother told him, thinking she was preparing him for a shock, that the bride they'd long searched for, the one unmatched in beauty, intelligence, and lineage, had died. She said it while hiding deep regret in her voice. "A rare girl with no equal, engaged to you, but God's will decreed she die suddenly before seeing you." The prince replied without showing sympathy or sorrow, as if freed from a heavy burden. "The best thing, and praise God." The king became very angry and shouted with anger emerging from his heart's depths, "By God, you're a blight on my forehead. Nay, an affliction descended upon my lineage. If you were a sensible young man as you should be, you'd now have 10 children, and I'd rest easy and be assured about the throne and the kingdom's future." Jawed lowered his head. His father's words hurt him, but he found no decisive response. He knew he was saddening him, burdening him with worry, and loading him with unbearable anxiety. He said calmly, trying to soften the atmosphere and placate his father, "Father, if that girl you spoke of were still alive, I would have married her for your sake. But she died, and this is God's will." The king shouted, waving his hand wearily, "Go now, be gone from my sight." Jawed bowed before him, then withdrew silently to his private wing in the palace, without uttering another word. But he didn't rest in his sleep that night. He remained in his room, tossing in his bed, gazing at the chamber ceiling, then rising to stare from the long window. He wasn't thinking about the bride who died, but about something else filling his head. That long-haired girl who'd appeared in the forest, then disappeared. He wondered within himself, if I found her again, would I dare marry her? Am I ready to choose by my own will, even once in my life? Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Saba was living her life in the forest depths, in a small cabin she'd built with her own hands, in a remote place, untrodden by human feet. She didn't fear loneliness or dread wild animals. Rather, she was calm to a degree that would astonish any human. She'd chosen an extremely isolated location, completely away from hunters and lumberjacks' paths, and ensured its security by means that wouldn't occur to anyone. Saba was a brilliant scientist in chemistry, plants, and strange mixtures. She'd prepared special mixtures that confused insects' senses and disturbed forest predators. By these ingenious methods, Saba secured for herself an isolated but completely safe place. She moved from her location and returned to it without difficulty, because she alone possessed an accurate map of the forest, its passages, secret paths, and wildernesses known to no one. She'd drawn the map with her own hands after years of wandering, observations, and experimentation. Among the trees, books, and simple observatories she'd built, Saba began returning to her old passion for studying sciences, reading at night, experimenting by day, and the days passing as if she wanted nothing except to complete her project in peace. But one thing weighed on her heart: her uncle, the kind man who'd raised her since childhood. She knew he was worried and perhaps thought her truly dead, so she decided to send him a message to reassure him. She wrote in her own handwriting, "I'm well, Uncle, in complete safety and deep happiness. Don't worry about me." Then she closed the letter, wrapped it carefully, and tied it to the leg of a carrier pigeon she'd trained herself years ago, a smart bird that knew its way precisely, flew with lightning speed, and left behind no trace that could be followed. Indeed, when the message reached her uncle's hand, he nearly wept with joy. But he'd barely raised his head to observe the bird before it had disappeared into the sky. No one knew where it came from or where it went. In the palace, Jawed was somewhat pleased when news reached him of the death of the bride they'd nearly forced upon him. He felt he'd escaped a cunningly woven trap. But at the same time, he wasn't oblivious to his parents' heartache, or the sorrow he saw shadowed in his father's eyes and his mother's distress. For that reason, he decided to abandon his pride, even if just once, and please his parents at any cost. He said to himself, "I'll marry whomever they choose, just to give them peace." But as soon as the image of the forest girl returned to his mind, his resolution began to crumble from within. Those feelings that had ambushed him in their brief encounter weren't passing. There was something in her resembling magic, something he couldn't ignore. He began wondering, what if she's from a simple class, or an enchanted sorceress, as her appearance suggests? Could I marry her publicly? He thought long about the matter and finally made a strange decision. Fine, if it turns out she's from a class unsuitable for me. I'll marry a noblewoman to please my father and mother, but I'll take her as a secret wife, a wife no one knows about. I'll visit her in disguise, claiming hunting trips. Then he smiled sarcastically, imagining himself sneaking from the palace, wearing hunter's cloaks to spend days with his secret wife in the middle of the forest. He said, laughing to himself, "It will be an enjoyable adventure and wonderful deception for everyone." But, as usual, dreams don't come true easily. The prince spent entire months searching for the mysterious girl, exploring the forest wildernesses, following every branch path and every tree shadow. He sent scouts, disguised himself, and penetrated isolated paths, but to no avail. Every time he returned to the palace, he returned empty-handed until despair began seeping into his heart. One night, he returned exhausted and troubled, sitting in his room, his body aching as if carrying mountains on his shoulders. His mother, the queen, saw him and was frightened. As for the king, he stood grimly watching his son's pale face. Doctors came urgently, examined him carefully, and found no apparent disease. But they couldn't explain what had befallen him. The king was terrified, seeing with his own eyes that his only son had become a ghost. He feared for his lineage, his throne, his dynasty's future. He shouted violently, "I'll marry him immediately, even against his will, even by the whip." His tone was harsh to a degree that confused even his wife, the queen, who took refuge in silence, having no objection. The king continued his speech with a tone escalating with each word. "The governor of the Blue River province has 4 daughters, all beautiful. My son will marry them all at once." "What?" shouted the queen, astonished, her eyes widening as if hearing madness. But the king answered with amazing simplicity, "He's my only one, and I have no son but him. I'll marry him to all of them in one night, so the palace fills with grandchildren. I want 4 sons born to me in 1 year." He imagined the scene in his mind and laughed, extending his hands upward as if receiving offspring with his hands. As for the queen, despite her conviction of its impossibility, she didn't object, but contented herself with silence, hoping the Blue River governor would refuse this strange request. But the great surprise came quickly. The reply arrived from the governor with a short message. "It's a great honor. We congratulate the prince on his marriage to our 4 daughters." The queen was shocked by the governor's acceptance and couldn't believe a sane man could agree to marry his 4 daughters in one night. But the surprise didn't end there. When the king informed his son, the prince, of his decisive decision, the latter fell into a real shock, nearly losing consciousness from the horror of what he heard. Not just a forced marriage, but 4 brides at once. He felt as if the world were falling on his head. He found no escape or excuse to flee with. He even thought of fleeing, disguising himself, rebelling, but he returned to his silence and accepted the matter reluctantly. Nevertheless, before announcing the engagement and before ceremonies and preparations began, Jawed asked his father a request that seemed simple on the surface, but deep within. "I ask your permission, father, for one last hunting trip, a farewell trip to my previous life, to my freedom that won't return." The king contemplated his son's face and felt for a moment the weight of sadness in his eyes. He nodded his head in agreement and postponed everything until the prince returned. He granted him a few days to be alone with himself as he wished. As soon as the prince left, he headed toward the forest, not to hunt, but to try one last time to find the strange forest girl who'd affected his heart. Meanwhile, the king received sad news that increased his gloom and worry. The kind nobleman, Saba's uncle, one of his old friends and a man known for wisdom and nobility had been struck by a mysterious illness that suddenly bedridden him. Doctors' attempts to cure him failed. Indeed, they confirmed his end was imminent, and he might leave life at any moment. The king was saddened and sent someone to watch over his comfort, and wrote to him personally a message of condolence and friendship. As for Saba, she'd been living her days in her content isolation, far from all noise. She didn't need anyone. Her life was simple but full of knowledge, calm, and peace. She went out hunting, raised a few sheep, prepared her food with her own hands, and extracted medicine from tree leaves and algae. She lived an ascetic life, but loved it truly, and was completely content with it. Until news came to her like a thunderbolt, she'd sent her carrier pigeon, as she'd been accustomed every 2 weeks, to check on her family. Her elderly nursemaid, her faithful attendant, was the only one who knew her secret, receiving letters and replying. But this time, the pigeon returned with a short message. "Your uncle is very ill, Saba. Doctors have despaired of his recovery and say he's dying." Blood froze in Saba's veins, and her insides shook as they hadn't shaken since she'd left the city. She stood in the middle of her cabin, unable to move, tears flowing from her eyes without sound. Her uncle, the man who'd raised her, defended her, embraced her in her childhood when she cried in fear of darkness. A violent struggle ignited within her. Should she go or not? Should she return and risk being imprisoned or forced into marriage, or stay here and regret all her life if he died without her seeing him? She was talking to herself audibly, walking in the cabin back and forth, her mind ablaze and her heart pounding. She finally said it with a final decision, but she knew perfectly well that her conscience would never rest if she didn't bid farewell to the man who'd been a father and support to her. After long confusion and hesitation that weighed on her heart, she decided it was her duty and her uncle's right over her to visit him, even one last time before he left life. She wore her dark cloak, put in her leather bag a number of her medical compounds and some herbal prescriptions. She closed her cabin firmly, then opened the small pen door and released the flock of sheep into the forest to eat from its leaves and grasses as it was accustomed. She breathed deeply and cast a quick farewell glance at her beloved cabin. Then she began her journey until, after many hours, she reached a small village for lumberjacks at the forest edges. There she wrapped herself well in her cloak until her features disappeared, then asked one of the porters to carry her things and rented a cart pulled by a mule to transport her to the city. At sunset, when the sun tilted toward the west, Saba had reached the city gates. She wasted no time but headed immediately toward the fortress where she'd grown up. She passed its guards, hiding her face, pretending to be one of the visiting women or maids who came to check on the sick nobleman and console his family. Since the fortress was bustling with activity, no one paid attention to her. She advanced toward her uncle's room. There she saw the elderly attendant, so she raised her hand and called to her in a whisper. The attendant turned, and as soon as her gaze fell on Saba, she rushed toward her, embracing her, while tears of joy filled her eyes. "I thought you'd never return. There's no time for talk now. Take me to my uncle." The attendant quickly brought her into his room, where the uncle lay on his bed, sinking between heavy pillows, his face pale. As for his wife, she was stunned to see the girl, shocked as if seeing a ghost, but the uncle, despite his weakness, felt something strange, a familiar scent, a breath he knew. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the girl standing beside his bed. As soon as he discerned her features, a faint smile appeared on his lips. He tried to speak, but illness had weighed down his tongue. Saba knelt at his feet, kissed his hands, then sat near him calmly and took out her small tools and began examining him. His wife said, watching the scene with concern, "Doctors and healers have exhausted all means, and everyone has failed. Don't worsen his condition." Saba raised her eyes toward her and looked at her steadily, then whispered with a firm tone, "Be quiet. Nothing worse than what he's in can befall him." She gave her uncle the first dose of a warm herbal compound, then a second of another color. After minutes, his tense body calmed, his chest relaxed, and he began snoring in deep sleep. His wife suddenly screamed, "He's dying! You've killed him! You cursed one!" But Saba exploded at her with a sharpness she'd never known before. "Enough screaming! The fever has left him. Haven't you touched his forehead?" The woman hesitated but extended her hand to her husband's forehead and placed her palm there. She was surprised. Indeed, the temperature had begun dropping, and the body had regained some of its natural warmth. She retreated in silence, confusion and bewilderment mixing within her. As for Saba, she remained beside her uncle, not leaving him. Every 2 hours she gave him a different dose with precision, in timing and studied composition. When dawn light appeared, the old man awoke. He opened his eyes fully and gazed at his brother's daughter's face, then said, "Saba, my little angel, you've returned." She smiled while her tears mixed with joy. The fever had completely vanished, and the body began gradually regaining its strength. That day the king arrived at the fortress to visit his friend, the nobleman Saba's uncle. He was accompanied by a small number of courtiers and guards, being careful not to cause a commotion or embarrassment for the patient. The king was pleased when he learned the nobleman had begun recovering, and a smile of sincere relief appeared on his face. He was immediately brought into the sick man's room. As soon as the man saw the king, he tried to rise with difficulty despite his weakness. The king gently held him and said, "Easy, my friend. Sit in your place. There's no need for this." The king sat beside him and asked about his health. At that moment, Saba entered the room, carrying a new dose of medicine. As soon as she saw the king, she became confused and froze in place. As for the king, he was equally stunned by her captivating beauty, steady gaze, and mysterious stillness. He said to the uncle in a low tone, tinged with anger, "Didn't we ask for your brother's daughter's hand for our son, and you claim to us she died? Is this the face of a dead woman, my friend?" The uncle was shocked and felt as if the world were ending around him. He didn't know how to answer. But Saba, with rare quick-wittedness, stepped forward with calm steps before the king and said, "To my lord, with complete respect and appreciation, it wasn't me but my twin sister who you requested her hand." The king was astonished and said, "Twins? Are you truly twins?" Saba swallowed her anxiety and answered confidently without her tone wavering, "Rather, we were 3 triplets, my lord. The third died in childhood, and only my sister and I remained. May God have mercy on her." The king observed her with a long, scrutinizing look, but found nothing in her voice or features to arouse suspicion. He sighed and said, "Glory be to God. Truly a strange matter." He returned to speaking with the uncle gently, his tone softening, but his eyes occasionally wandered toward Saba. Her stunning beauty, her intelligence, her composure, and he thought about the matter anew. He said to himself, "A girl like this deserves to be a bride for my son, not the daughters of the Blue River governor." But he quickly retreated and said, "But how can I break our official commitment to the Blue River province prince? He's already agreed, sent his daughters, and prepared everything. Meanwhile, as always, Jawed returned from the forest, empty-handed, finding no trace of the girl who'd ignited his heart despite all his attempts and despair. He stood in the palace garden that evening, looking toward the trees, saying, "Perhaps she was just a dream, or perhaps she was a witch, as my companions say." But in the end, there was no choice before him now except to submit to his parents' wishes and accept a marriage without soul, hoping to please the king and queen and produce the awaited heirs. He entered the reception hall, looking exhausted. The king was returning from his trip just a few hours after him. The father smiled at his son and said with a joyful tone, "Jawed, I have a new surprise for you. We found you a bride unmatched among the daughters of the earth." The prince sighed and said, "And where did my marriage project to the Blue River governor's daughters go? Don't tell me, father, that you'll add a fifth to them." The king laughed loudly and said jokingly, "By God, I have no objection. Were it not that your mother would revolt and fear I'd do with her as I do with you." The prince laughed in turn, then looked at him seriously and said, "And who is this new bride?" The father sat beside him and began telling him everything about the sick nobleman, about the girl who'd saved him from death, about her lineage, composure, and indescribable beauty. Then the king added, "And most importantly, she's from a great family. According to what I learned, her grandfather was a brilliant alchemist. It's said he left behind a huge secret fortune, jars filled with gold he made himself from metals through a science known to no one but him." Jawed's eyes widened in amazement, and he said, "A secret fortune? Gold and inheritance? And who knows about this?" The king said, "No one knows the location precisely, but as soon as this girl becomes your wife, the door to this wondrous alchemical inheritance will open to you." The prince sat with his head bowed, thinking about the matter. The talk about secret fortune and the ideal bride seemed somewhat ridiculous in the prince's view, but he pretended to believe it and nodded in agreement. He said to his father, "I'm satisfied with any decision you make, father. Choose for me whom you wish, and I'll marry her." The king's face lit up, and he felt the euphoria of victory, as if he'd finally settled his son's marriage issue and cut doubt with certainty. He said joyfully, "Then we forget the Blue River governor's daughters. This noblewoman is better than all of them." But to ensure the governor's withdrawal without direct confrontation or anger, the king decided to send him a misleading message that didn't include a direct refusal, but deluded him into hastening to prepare his daughters and arrive with them at the court by the deadline, sunset on the 17th day of this month. The king said, laughing while discussing the matter with the queen, "Today is the 14th, meaning he has only 3 nights and 2 days left. He'll never have enough time." The queen smiled broadly, feeling relieved, as she hadn't originally been comfortable with the idea of marrying her son to 5 women at once, and considered this trick an elegant way to retreat without embarrassment. In the nobleman's fortress, the uncle had begun recovering from his terminal illness. He sat in his bed for the first time in days and began eating slowly. His face began regaining some of its radiance. When he saw Saba beside him, reassured, he told her what had happened during her brief absence from the palace. "The king himself has proposed you to his son, Prince Jawed, the crown prince." Saba was shocked as if someone had slapped her and exclaimed, "Ugh, a truly persistent family. Didn't we get rid of this matter before?" The uncle laughed, then suddenly frowned and said, "There's no escape, my daughter. If we refuse this time, our necks may fly." The girl's features changed, and anger ignited in her eyes. She said, "And what does that mean? Do people marry by coercion? Is a human sold like an ornament to satisfy the king's vanity?" The uncle tried to calm her, and it wasn't easy for him to ask her for sacrifice. But he reminded her of his favor to her and his raising of her. And when she lost her parents, he was a father, teacher, and shelter. Saba lowered her head outwardly, and after a short silence said, "Fine. If this pleases you, uncle, then I agree." But he didn't see what was going on behind her calm forehead. Deep in her decision, she was devising a new plan no less clever than the first one. At that moment, the Blue River Prince was in a race against time. As soon as he received the king's message, he was struck with panic. But it seemed to him like a final call, as if a hidden signal that whoever delayed would miss the golden opportunity. He immediately gathered his men and prepared his 4 daughters with everything imaginable in adornment, trousseau, and gifts until the corridors filled with silks, clothes, and jewels. Then he consulted his men about the fastest way to reach the capital. One of them said, "The land route is long and arduous, but if we board a ship from our city and travel with the river current, we'll arrive in less than 2 days." The governor was pleased and said, "Praise God, the opportunity hasn't been lost yet." He ordered his daughters loaded along with their attendants, entourage, and mountains of gifts onto a huge royal ship until it groaned with its load from how much was placed on it. The ship immediately set off toward the capital, cutting through the water with weight, but dragging with it dreams of marrying into the king's family and the crown of glory, or a beautiful delusion about to vanish. On the other end, compelled, the prince went to execute his father's order to meet his new fiancée Saba. He arrived at the fortress, and inside he felt deep aversion to the matter. But he hid his feelings behind a mask of courtesy and obedience. He was received with great warmth and brought into the hall, prepared for the meeting. Then Saba entered. She was completely covered from head to toe in a dark wide cloak, hiding all her features. Nothing of her showed. She sat far away, having turned her face aside without looking at him. Then he sat, showing his composure and courtesy, trying to go along with the meeting, but he was suffocating from within. He began asking her with feigned indifference, "What's your name? How old are you? What do you know, and what lands have you visited?" All he received in return were silent nods from her head without uttering a single word. His boredom increased, and he felt anger rising in his chest. He said sarcastically, "Are you mute? It would be a lovely thing to marry a girl who doesn't speak. That's the only trait I've always dreamed of." But she answered him with nothing except a headshake denying that. An explosion of sarcastic relief burst within him, stupid and foolish. Praise God, this is the argument I'll cling to before my father, and he won't be able to argue with me. He rose calmly and asked permission politely, hiding his eagerness to flee in a feigned tone of respect. As soon as the girl nodded her approval, he launched from his place as if fleeing a deadly trap. As for Saba, she exhaled deeply. She stood quickly, then lifted the cover from her face. Her rest returned to her, and a radiant, luminous face appeared. Her amazing hair cascaded over her shoulders until its ends touched the ground. She smiled triumphantly, whispering to herself, "Take that. You've been deceived, Prince. Deceived a second time." But suddenly she heard a sharp gasp from behind her. She turned to find Jawed standing at the room entrance, astonished. He'd returned to get his glove that he'd forgotten. He froze in place, looking at her as if seeing a ghost or a dream embodied before him. He shouted and said, "You! My God, it's you, the forest girl. You're the one I was searching for." The next day, the royal wedding ceremony was held, which dazzled and amazed people's eyes. The palace was decorated with glittering torches. Tables were spread the length of the courtyards to feed thousands of people from the city inhabitants and kingdom outskirts, and flowers and perfumes were scattered everywhere. But inside the bride's wing, a different kind of battle was taking place. Saba was resisting, screaming, refusing to wear the wedding dress. She refused the crown, refused adornment, and even refused to be called the bride. The queen tried to calm her. With her were her uncle's wife and a number of attendants and maids, all trying to lighten the atmosphere and reassure her by talking about her coming happiness and the glory awaiting her as the crown prince's wife. But Saba didn't want glory, adornment, or throne. She was screaming, pushing their hands away, and waving her hands in the air. "I don't want it. I won't wear it. I won't marry you all." The queen began losing her patience and became very angry, thinking the girl was insulting her son and belittling his status. She left the wing angrily and said, "Let her handle herself alone." After minutes, the maids and attendants left, and Saba remained alone in heavy silence. She sat on the floor, breathing slowly. Then suddenly an idea flashed in her mind, bold, crazy. "I'll escape. Yes, I'll escape from all this, return to the forest, to my cabin, to the life I chose myself." She removed the wedding dress and placed the crown on the floor. She took off her luxurious shoes and moved lightly. She began climbing the room shelves until she reached a high window. She looked from it. Below was a wide stone ledge extending along the wall. She said, whispering as she observed the edge, "I can walk on it to the end, then jump to the adjacent window, and from there to the garden, then to the back gate, then the forest." Her eyes filled with determination. "This isn't my wedding party. This is my great escape." It was an improvised plan. Indeed, a crazy one, but the only salvation in Saba's view. If she stayed, she'd be imprisoned forever between golden walls. If she escaped, she'd regain her freedom, even at a steep price. With dancing lightness, she moved on the stone ledge, balancing with the climber's expertise she'd trained for in the forest. Then she reached the second window, which was low enough to get her to the ground safely. She extended her arms to cling to the edge and descend. But an amazing surprise paralyzed her limbs. Two strong arms suddenly extended toward her and gently grabbed her. She looked terrified and saw a familiar face standing below, smiling at her with eyes she knew well. It was the prince, Prince Jawed, he said jokingly while securing his grip on her hands. A little plan, completely expected from the wild forest girl. She realized he was preventing her from falling, not from escaping. She allowed him to pull her until she reached the ground. She stood before him, her body rigid, her gaze blazing. She said with angry defiance, "Why won't you let me go, man? Don't I have the right to escape?" He smiled again and said, "You can't escape, Naja, because we're getting married today." She exploded angrily and said, "I've told you 1,000 times. My name is Saba, and I'm not that girl you imagine." He laughed and said, "Ah, by God. Fine, if you're not her, then you're the most beautiful deception I've fallen into." She shouted at him, "Get away from me immediately." But he replied calmly with sincere eyes and a tender voice free of sarcasm. "Listen to me, Saba. I know you hate living in palaces and fear being a confined wife, but I promise you one thing only. I'll make your life with me resemble the forest, full of air, light, and freedom." Saba became confused and looked at him suspiciously, saying, "And what do you mean? Is this a new trick?" He smiled and leaned toward her, saying, "You and I are very similar. Neither of us wanted marriage, and both of us tried to escape from the world. But fate decided to force us to meet. Should we waste this opportunity?" She hesitated, so he continued his speech enthusiastically. "Listen to me. We'll build a life of our own that resembles no one else's. We'll live as we wish, establish a family in our own way, continue your experiments with recipes, and teach our children the art of alchemy." Then he smiled as if delivering a surprise and said, "Do you know where we'll spend our honeymoon?" She eyed him cautiously and said, "Where?" He said confidently, laughing, "In the forest. I've built us a wonderful wooden cabin, exactly as you dreamed. I'll learn from you how to make recipes, and I'll be your first student." Saba stopped and laughed, despite herself. She was about to protest, but he silenced her gently and kindly, saying, "I promise you before God, if you don't like living with me and don't love being my wife, I'll let you go and live in the forest alone. I'll return there to tell them a wild animal kidnapped you and I couldn't save you. Then we can remain just friends." Saba turned her head away, thinking about what he was saying. While she was immersed in her thoughts, a large procession arrived at the palace gate. It was the Blue River Prince's procession with his daughters. George's face paled with fear that he'd find himself forced to marry them instead of Saba, whom he truly loved and had come to desire as his bride if the latter refused his offer. Heavy minutes passed, but suddenly the girl looked at him and exclaimed with a shy smile, "Fine, but you'll commit to your promise if I decide so." He answered with a wide smile, "Yes, I will." Finally, the girl gave him her hand, and he took it and left with her. While they walked together in the corridor, people and attendants were astonished, finding the bride without a wedding gown, in simple clothes, without a crown or even shoes. As for the prince, he was wearing ordinary clothes, without decorations or sword. Despite the attendees' amazement and the king and queen's displeasure, the wedding ceremony was quickly held. When the Blue River Prince entered with his daughters, announcing his arrival for their wedding to the prince, he found the prince had already married Saba, and nothing remained for the four daughters except to play the role of wedding attendants. Once again, Saba walked with her groom the prince, but her features spoke of happiness and satisfaction. The prince was faithful to his promise and kept his word. He went with his bride to the forest, and they spent a long, sweet month together. When Jawed finally returned to the palace, the new princess was clinging to his arm, gripping him tightly. Happy days passed for them. They became accustomed to going to the forest from time to time. The prince learned the craft of alchemy and composing recipes from his wife. As for her, she learned from him love and the marks of true manhood. Their happiness was soon completed with the birth of their first child, a beautiful little boy who bore his grandfather the king's name, whose heart and his wife's heart were filled with joy and contentment and peace of mind. The story has ended. The story has ended.